join me in welcoming Marcia Nikos.
Thank you so much, Natan, for that really lovely introduction. I'm so glad to be here. Thanks to Temple Israel for hosting this, and thanks to the Center for Jewish Studies for all their work organizing this. As you heard, I teach in a Jewish studies department, and my training is in academic religious studies. Those of you who are religious studies scholars will know that religious studies can mean many different things to many different people, many different scholars. But for me, being a religious studies scholar means asking questions about how people make meaning in their lives. So, like a lot of other religious studies scholars, I think that one of the goals of religious studies is making the familiar strange and the strange familiar. So this work is on the first part of that phrase, making the familiar strange. So a lot of my work has been on analyzing everyday activities that we might take for granted. I think about the ways that we tell stories about ourselves, our families, and our communities through everyday activities, and the ways that we ask weighty existential questions like, who am I and where do I come from? I think these are really ordinary, everyday questions, but they are still remarkable ones. So I'm gonna begin with one of my favorite ordinary moments from my research on the way that I see American Jews making meaning in their lives and asking existential questions. I'm going to take you to another grand sanctuary, to the museum at Eldridge Street in the beautifully restored 1887 Eldridge Street Synagogue on the Lower East Side of New York. And one summer, I watched a docent sit tourists down in the pews of this beautifully restored synagogue, listen to a docent tell the history of this grand synagogue built by Eastern European Jewish immigrants. When the docent finished, as she led the group out of the sanctuary, the docent pauses at the back of the room. Step into the indentations in the floorboard, she says, and soon people have arranged themselves into straight lines. And pointing to the pattern of indentations, she asks, why do you think these are here? And slowly, the group realizes that they are standing very literally in the footprints of former male congregants. The indentations have been made by men shuckling, rocking back and forth in front of their pew as they prayed in the traditional Jewish fashion. And over the years, they had literally left their mark in the soft pine floorboards. And sometimes the docent demonstrates the movement, and others copy her. And some of the tourists are familiar with the movement from their own synagogue services. Some of them are shuffling more awkwardly, if enthusiastically. But standing in the footprints of the former congregants provides an immediate sensory connection to the past, one that engages visitors' entire bodies. And the experience is, of course, a highlight for many tourists. As somebody wrote on Yelp, you literally feel the history at your feet. So the docent has carefully orchestrated this moment to help visitors experience a connection to the past, both physically and emotionally. So in my book, Beyond the Synagogue, Jewish Nostalgia as Religious Practice, I look at the materials and institutions through which American Jews engage, promote, and teach nostalgia for turn of the 20th century Jewish immigration from Central and Eastern Europe to the United States. And I find that nostalgia, which in this case is a sentimental longing for Jewish community origins that can't be fulfilled, nostalgia can be both an emotion and a practice. And as a feeling and as a practice, I'm going to argue that nostalgia has become an important part of American Jewish religion since the 1970s and into the present day. And in this book, I look at 4 case studies. I look at the materials and institutions of Jewish genealogists. I look at historic synagogues used as museums, children's books and dolls, and artisanal delis and other Jewish food sites. And I find that some of these items and some of these places and the institutions that create and promote and distribute them encourage American Jews to feel nostalgia for a particular story of Ashkenazi history, the story of Jews whose ancestors came from Central and Eastern Europe, and that nostalgia is best understood as American Jewish religion. And this is going to require us to expand our understanding of what counts as religious practice and where we look for religious activities. So what I'm going to do in the rest of our time together is think about what kind of nostalgia I'm talking about, what we mean by nostalgia, and really what I mean by religion. And I'll trace the historical development of American Jewish nostalgia, the forms that it takes, the places where I see it, and I'm going to wrap up by thinking about one of the implications of taking this kind of nostalgia seriously. Some scholars and Jewish community leaders worry that American Jews' religiosity is in the decline, but I'm going to suggest that my research shows that American Judaism is not just in decline, but is in fact evolving and flourishing. So, what are we talking about when we talk about religion? Many religious studies scholars are increasingly recognizing that the concept of religion, as we normally think about it, is really a modern Protestant creation when we think about recognizable acts of worship and personal belief. Jewish thinkers and Jewish community leaders have deliberately worked hard to make Judaism fit this model. Sometimes does, because they've worked really hard to squeeze it into this Protestant model. But I think that divisions between Jewish religion and Jewish culture flatten the dynamic ways that American Jews make meaning in their lives. This is very funny to talk about from the bima of this grand synagogue. I think that religion is best understood as meaningful relationships and the practices, narratives, and emotions that create and support these relationships. Those of you who are religious studies scholars in the room will recognize Bob Orsi in this. We might think of religion as relationships among the living, those of us in this room and in this community, between the living and the dead, between us and our ancestors, and maybe between humans and the divine, which is also what we're doing here. And each of these kinds of relationships can be emphasized in different ways and at different times. So my teacher, the religious studies scholar Catherine Lofton, says religion is a way of describing the structures by which we are bound or connected to one another. So thinking about people's families, their relationships with their families, their communities, their ancestors, and the divine as central to religion lets us think about how people who don't think of themselves as religious make meaning in their lives, as well as how those of us who do think of ourselves as religious find meaning both within and also beyond traditional practices, guided by a variety of supposedly secular institutions and materials. And this slide behind me is a collage of the family photographs of the writer Sheldon Oberman, which I'm going to return to. But I think it's a really good illustration of the kind of connections between traditional religious practices and the ways that something like family relationships can help us answer existential questions about who we are and what we're doing in this world. Now, definitions of religion are not just matters of academic theory. I think I'm so lucky that I get to do this for a living, but I think that there's reasons for all of us to think about what counts as religion in our lives and in the lives of other people. First, how we define religion has really serious legal implications in the United States. Definitions of religion and religious freedom have been used to strengthen white Protestants' claims to racial and religious supremacy. Organizations like this fine one that are denoted as religious do not pay taxes, and we give other privileges to religious groups and religious spaces too. And as Natan was just telling us, Native Americans, for instance, have repeatedly made the case usually unsuccessfully, that their practices and their spaces count as religious in a legal sense for these reasons. So I'm not going to suggest that the things that I am arguing are religious should be or will be counted as religiously legal, but I do want us to understand that the stakes of debating what counts as religion are extremely high, and it is something that we actually debate all the time in American society. Secondly, in the Jewish community, many decisions about large-scale philanthropy are often made in a way that is related to what counts as religion. Many major philanthropists have been persuaded to give money to Jewish organizations that are ultimately designed to make Jews, especially younger Jews, either more traditionally religious or more tied to the recognizable institutions of American Jewish religion. So there's a lot of money at stake. Third, and maybe most importantly to me, I think that thinking broadly about religion offers a new and I would suggest a better way to help us think about how we and how other people are making meaning in our lives and how we place ourselves inside stories that we think are important. So thinking about American Jews' nostalgia for Eastern European heritage helps us think about how religion works for many American Jews. American Jews' nostalgic activities connect them to communities that include both the living and the dead. They provide meaning in the present by telling stories about the past, two important features of religious practice, things you do in synagogue all the time. These nostalgic activities build on traditional religious forms of Jewish memory, like how participants at the Seder, which I'm sure we're all starting to think about, the home ritual for the holiday of Passover, recite that they too should feel as if they had been freed from Egypt. But thinking about nostalgia as an American Jewish religious practice also helps us think about how American Jews make meaning in their lives beyond holidays and traditional religious practices in our everyday lives. So what I'm doing in this project, in thinking about how nostalgia for Eastern European heritage has become so important, so prevalent, so institutionalized and standardized that it should be understood as part of American Jewish religion, this is related to some recent critiques of what some people call Ashkenormativity. Ashkenormativity is a word that draws attention to the ways that European heritage, especially Eastern European heritage, is prioritized in American Jewish cultures and is often assumed to be the Jewish identity or the American Jewish identity to the detriment of Sephardi, Mizrahi, and other non-Ashkenazi backgrounds. I think that if we want to critique Ashkenormativity, the very first thing we need to do is to understand how it works, including through the nostalgic stories of Eastern European immigration. This is the background work to doing the activist work of dismantling or building upon or expanding beyond Ashkenormativity. So, of course, tourists at the museum at Eldridge Street didn't just happen to arrive at the historic synagogue and place their feet in the grooves of long ago congregants. American Jews have long seen the Lower East Side as a site of authentic emotional connection to community history. Although American Jewish history, as you may know, Jewish history in the Americas dates back to the earliest years of European colonialism, the majority of American Jews are descendants from Central and Eastern Europeans who immigrated to the United States between 1880 and 1924. Many of them, not all of them, but many of them settled in New York's Lower East Side and other urban immigrant neighborhoods. And in the mid-20th century, they began to move their families out of the crowded neighborhoods for more spacious parts of the city and into the suburbs. And they kept thinking about the neighborhood and the old neighborhood, and some kept coming back. And in the early 20th century, the Jews who had left the Lower East Side or other urban immigrant neighborhoods were replaced by new arrivals until Congress severely limited immigration in 1924. And beginning in the 1970s and 1980s, as what scholars call a white ethnic revival turned many Americans' attention to their ancestries, American Jews began to think about their former urban ethnic neighborhoods with nostalgic longing. And as they did so, American Jews reflected together on this history in a number of ways. In the mid-1970s, American Jews were inspired by the African American roots movement of that era, which was named for Alex Haley's 1976 book Roots. It was an imaginative history of an African American family. And inspired by that work, American Jewish genealogists began to organize and educate themselves. They wrote manuals and created Jewish genealogical societies. A decade later, in the 1980s, historians and preservationists started paying attention in earnest to the role that historic synagogues could play in Jewish public life. In the 1990s, mainstream publishing houses started publishing increasing numbers of children's books depicting stories of Jewish immigration as part of the broader story of American multiculturalism. And more recently, in the early 21st century, the Eastern European Jewish culinary revival began in earnest with the appearance of new artisanal delis and other businesses created by Jewish food entrepreneurs. American Jews could connect to this past and other Jewish histories through a variety of older types of Jewish institutions and media, like passively watching a movie or a live performance of Fiddler on the Roof, which many of us have probably done. But I think the new materials of American Jewish nostalgia that I'm looking at encourage a more active longing, more active personal longing for Eastern European Jewish immigration history. I think that nostalgia helps us build the connection between our own family history and larger community stories. Longing is active, not passive. So Jewish genealogists actively research their family histories, parents read illustrated books aloud and encourage children to play with certain toys, restaurant patrons literally consume their longing for Eastern European immigration history. Visitors at historic synagogues step into the footprints of past congregants literally and metaphorically. And the tour guides at the museum at Eldridge Street work hard to bring visitors into this story. Nostalgic forms of pop culture help us pass on stories and values to generations, just as traditional religious practices do. We don't normally, for instance, take restaurants seriously either as sites of religion or as sites of public history. Those are programs or institutions like museums that teach history to a broad public. But restaurants can actually significantly shape our emotional reactions to certain histories. Eating is an intimate act that encourages asking and answering questions about ourselves, our identities, and our communities. And Jewish restaurants encourage patrons to share their own family stories. Elise Lerner, the owner of On Rye, a since-closed deli in Washington, D.C., told me, a lot of people come in and they want to tell us their experiences that they've had with this food growing up. So a lot of restaurateurs and purveyors of Jewish food tell stories of their family histories and of Jewish community histories through their food, their decor, and their presentation. And like all sites of public history, these eateries have a particular point of view. So for Karen Edelman of Saul's Deli in Berkeley, maybe some of the Berkeley folks are familiar with it, in California, the principal story told of Saul's Deli is that of Ashkenazi Jews from the old world and then New York, and then they keep going west, skipping Minnesota maybe, until they reach California, making Saul's Deli and its patrons the pinnacle of Jewish history. So I love this story now as somebody who lives nearby in San Francisco, because it makes Berkeley and it makes Saul's the center of Jewish history. But I think that all nostalgic stories do that. They try to place us in the center of stories that matter emotionally. So these new forms of American Jewish history often involve thinking critically about the past and the effect of the past on the present, and they challenge who we think of as an authority on Jewish identity, history, and practice. And here I want to tell you about a pickle problem that the owners of Saul's Deli ran into. When Karen and Peter, the current owners of Saul's, bought Saul's, which had been a traditional deli, from its founding owner, many of the restaurant's ingredients were shipped from New York to Berkeley. and they were participating in the Bay Area's food movement in general, and they wanted to reshape their menu with local and seasonal ingredients. They wanted to honor Ashkenazi American cuisine by elevating it as they saw it. But they ran into a pickle problem. As you may or may not know, a half-sour pickle is properly made from a fresh cucumber, and it is eaten 6 to 20 days after pickling. After that, you no longer have a half-sour pickle on your hands, you have a full sour pickle on your hands. And Karen and Peter wanted to serve pickles made from local cucumbers, which are grown between June and November. But deli customers wanted to have a half-sour pickle available all year round next to their sandwiches. Customers at Saul's, for at least a short while, had to endure having a half-sour pickle alongside their sandwiches at Saul's only in seasonally appropriate months, with a side dish of lessons in agriculture, geography, and Jewish culinary history. And as you can imagine, this was a hard lesson for some customers to swallow, so to speak. Right? I think they eventually, yes. I think they eventually gave up on this, but I really admire that they tried. I want to suggest that these folks who are creating nostalgic American Jewish public history, they are deliberately working to create community around a certain historical story. I want to suggest that they should be considered a kind of community leader or even a religious expert. With all due respect to the many other community leaders and religious experts that we have, I think that Jewish genealogists and museum staff members and children's book authors and restaurateurs are creating and curating materials that shape an emotional and even a religious reaction to Jewish stories. These are Jews who have rarely been recognized as leaders or experts either in scholarship or in Jewish community conversations, and they are not even necessarily folks who see themselves as Jewish leaders. But acknowledging their leadership of these content creators points to the new types of Jewish community organizations that are shaping the world around us, and recognizing how they are shaping American Jews at least as much as those that we normally think of as Jewish community leaders, such as rabbis, directors of Jewish federations, American Zionist organizations, and certain other Jewish nonprofits. Let's see, I'm gonna suggest that just because the creators and curators of American Jewish nostalgia should be considered religious leaders doesn't mean that anybody is listening to them uncritically. This is something that other religious leaders in the room, maybe a rabbi, might be familiar with people pushing back a little bit. Many Jews are, for instance, not interested in listening to their family genealogist stories. Meanwhile, at historic synagogues, docents and staff members are providing rules of acceptable behavior to visitors, but maybe it won't surprise many of you in the room that, as I observed, Jewish visitors routinely refuse to follow these guidelines. Jewish visitors walk into historic Jewish spaces with a sense of entitlement, and staff members both want to encourage that and also corral it. Jewish deli owners, for instance, are telling stories about especially those telling stories of Jewish immigration beyond to New York, are also navigating conflicts with customers. Deli owners that I talked to told me that customers are constantly comparing restaurants outside New York to their ideal of a New York deli, even if the customers have not actually been to a New York deli in years, if ever, and even if the restaurateurs are repeatedly insisting that they are not trying to recreate a New York deli. So at Saul's in Berkeley, California, Peter and Karen explain recreating the New York deli is not our charge. Food, authenticity, flavor, sustainability, survival, and being true to the values of our culinary roots are our first priority. So like other Jewish culinary revivalists, Peter and Karen are attempting to shape customers, what I would call customers' framework of authenticity, what they see as real Judaism, from emulating an ideal place that probably doesn't exist to new stories about Jewish food, history, and memory. Nostalgia gives us an emotional connection to the past, but it also encourages the most simplistic, streamlined versions of any story. So the longing of American Jews for stories of Eastern European immigration at the turn of the century and for Eastern European histories deliberately centers Ashkenazi experiences, and it deliberately marginalizes other Jewish stories, right? This is what nostalgia does. So American Jewish genealogists might find that they have diverse backgrounds, but many I have found are drawn to family stories of Eastern European immigrants that fit this dominant narrative. This is how nostalgia works, and this is how Ashkenormativity works. The materials and practices of Ashkenazi nostalgia are deliberately necessarily excluding certain people and certain stories. And these nostalgic materials tell us about whose stories matter the most to American Jewish communities. One perhaps surprising place where I see American Jewish community leadership is the American Girl doll. American Girl, as you may or may not know, is a wildly popular Mattel-owned line of dolls, books, and accessories. It includes, but is not limited to, this line of historical characters representing 8 to 10-year-old girls at various points in American history. And in the summer of 2009, American Jewish immigration history officially entered the American Girl doll canon with the debut of its Rebecca Rubin character. She was the 10th character in the historical series. This doll and books and accessories create the fictional character of a Jewish 9-year-old girl living in Manhattan's Lower East Side neighborhood in 1914. The books were written by Jewish children's book author Jacqueline Dunbar Green, and she had actually previously written children's books about Sephardi Jewish history. I encourage you to look them up. And her own ancestry actually includes Sephardi Jews. She told me when I interviewed her that she was invited by American Girl to be a number of authors who would submit proposals to American Girl. And when she started working on this project, she considered telling a Sephardi story. And she also considered placing the story of an Ashkenazi Jewish immigrant in Boston, where she lives. But she ultimately decided, and I think with good reason, that the mainstream story of Eastern European immigrants in New York needed to be told first, and that was the story that would be accepted by Mattel. Because for many Jewish and non-Jewish consumers of American Girl, Rebecca Rubin is the Jewish story, and it matters that this story was told first, for better and definitely for worse. The Rebecca Rubin doll and books teach American children of all backgrounds that a connection to this certain type of American Jewish heritage is a way of being American in general, regardless of their family history. And the doll and the books and these adorable accessories encourage an emotional connection to Jewish immigration history as American identity through children's play and through consumer desire. Now, sometimes we do get other people's stories, other types of Jewish stories, as part of this narrative, but these other stories are folded into this mainstream Eastern European story. So for instance, the menu at Saul's Deli offers a number of dishes from Middle Eastern cuisine, inspired by Jewish cultures in that region. And serving selective Middle Eastern dishes allows Saul's to serve more vegan and vegetarian entrees, which, as you might imagine, is important for a restaurant in Berkeley, California, but is also challenging for a Jewish deli where meat is really the focus. Karen told me that broadening that story a little bit is a sidestep that's more inclusive of more Jewish pasts and more customers, and allows Saul's to continue to tell the story of Jewish food. And I really, really respect that. And Karen and Peter are friends of mine, have become friends of mine through this research. But I also want to point out that at the same time, this very inclusion of non-Ashkenazi stories, non-Ashkenazi food, folds these other types of food into the story of Eastern European nostalgia. So here what we get is a side dish that's Middle Eastern, but the larger platter and the deli itself remains focused on Central and Eastern European heritage. And I think this really points to the difficulties, like the serious challenges in moving beyond what some people call Ashkenormativity. And this is not a picture of Saul's, but I've included a picture of Challah food truck in Columbus, which did similar work. Like Challah, right? They're very cute. One other place where I see tensions around negotiating boundaries is in children's books. So I'm really interested in PJ Library, which, as you may know, is a program that distributes free children's books and music with Jewish content to Jewish and interfaith families. I happen to think that they are the most influential and most important Jewish organization in North America. They are wildly understudied. They do a lot of their own studies, but they're wildly understudied by other organizations. They emphasize that children's books are not just for children, but are meant to be read aloud by older family members who, like children, should be receptive to their messages about Jewish history and Jewish values. So these children's books are not just for children, but for the entire family. One book that was distributed by PJ Library is Sheldon Oberman's The Always Prayer Shawl, which tells the story of a boy's immigration from Eastern Europe to North America. Oberman himself was actually Canadian, but he made the story generically American to appeal to readers in the United States. My Canadian friends tell me that this is an extremely Canadian thing to do. The boy brings with him his grandfather's prayer shawl, which he eventually passes on to his own grandson. So the Always Prayer Shawl tells a particular story of Jewish immigration, and in fact it came out of Oberman's own experience of inheriting his grandfather's prayer shawl and giving a prayer shawl to his son. But Oberman encouraged audiences of all backgrounds to find themselves in the story of heirlooms and intergenerational connections. And he frequently wore his grandfather's actual prayer shawl while reading the book, The Always Prayer Shawl, aloud to audiences, expanding the religious use of the garment from a traditionally religious space, from the synagogue space, into a supposedly secular read aloud of his book. At one of these read-alouds, a non-Jewish author complimented Oberman at a reading, saying, "I wish I could tell stories like you." And he responded, I think this is so interesting, he responded by taking the prayer shawl off of his own shoulders, placing it around this non-Jewish author's shoulders and saying, "Yes, you can do it, you can tell stories just like this." So the prayer shawl and Oberman's story really comfortably incorporate Jews and non-Jews into the emotion and the network of relationships of North American Jewish nostalgia. So I think here we see nostalgia, Jewish nostalgia, serving American Jews as a type of religious practice, but it also becomes a kind of religious practice in which the boundaries are a little bit looser, and it's maybe a little bit easier to incorporate and include non-Jews in these practices. Okay, I've been talking for a while, and I'm going to wrap up, I promise, by thinking about how nostalgic activities such as touring the museum at Eldridge Street or buying a pastrami sandwich at a deli thinking about these things as religious practices, help me respond to the claims of Jewish leaders and sociologists who see Jewish religion on the decline in the United States. Since the mid-20th century, American Jewish community leaders have worried really loudly that American Jews' religiosity is waning. This is something that they often describe as assimilation into mainstream American culture. This is Look magazine's famous 1964 cover story about the vanishing American Jew. Some American Jewish historians like to point out that Look magazine no longer exists, but American Jews still do. That's an obligatory joke. In recent decades, Jewish community leaders have worried loudly about the effects of intermarriage in what's been termed a marriage crisis or a continuity crisis. With all due respect to congregational rabbis, they often tend to have a prescriptive definition of religion. They're often focused on synagogue attendance, performing holiday and life cycle celebrations. What is it they can see Jews doing? Looking for activities that can be measured, quantitative sociologists tend to have similar definitions of Jewish religion, such as attending synagogue, keeping kosher, sending children to Jewish religious schools. The most recent national study of American Jews, Pew Research Center's American Jews in 2020, comes out of this legacy, and it divides Jews into Jews by religion and Jews of no religion. These are very interesting categories because the Jews by religion are people who answer a survey and say, given a list of religions, what is your religion? And the people who answer Jewish are Jews by religion, right? So this is not what we normally think of as religion, either me or anybody else. And the people who end up on the Jews of no religion are the people who answer none of the above. They're people that religious studies scholars call nuns, religious nuns, as in none of the above. But these are the people who answered a follow-up question by saying that they consider themselves Jewish ethnically, culturally, or by family background. But they said no to the first question. So I want to suggest that American Jews, like other Americans, are just not very good at naming religion in their lives. And the division between Jews by religion and Jews of no religion and the related worries about the decline of American Jewish religion really just incorrectly identify the way that Jews think about and practice Judaism in the United States. When Jewish community leaders and sociologists distinguish between Jewish culture and Jewish religion, a lot of the ways that American Jews create meaning in their lives as individuals, families, and communities are flattened or even erased. And I think that a lot of the fears about assimilation resist the idea that Judaism, like all human activities, has and always will change over time. They rely on the idea of a static Judaism and a static American culture and see the two as mutually exclusive rather than as responsive to one another. And I think that we can see the dynamic nature of American Jewish religion in the practices of Jewish genealogists, at historic synagogues, in Jewish children's books, and at delis. And again, one really good word for the ways that we make meaning as individuals, families, and communities is religion. And here I'm just going to say one more thing and then I really will stop. I've been blessed to do a lot of public talks since my book came out, and as I've presented my research on Jewish genealogists, in particular to Jewish genealogical societies, some genealogists, often but not only men, respectfully disagree with my conclusions about nostalgia and religion, and that is okay. They prefer to see their work as archival or academic rather than as emotional or religious. Other Jewish genealogists, often but not only women, hear me naming something that resonated with them. We're doing more than recording names, one woman told me. And what I'm trying to do in this work is trying to name them more. So thank you very much. I welcome your questions and comments.
So I want to make sure you know, I don't know the rabbis you're talking to, but you haven't talked to me.
Amazing.
Let's just say, a lot of the things is not what I would ever say, so that's good.
Appreciate that.
But really interesting, right? Broadening, I love it about people who, I think it has become a truth, right? That it's not just position, but it is how much influence one has, just like in the world around us. There are influencers, and this is true as well in Judaism. So, what questions? Sure. So, call themselves religious if they don't believe in God. So they might do many, many Jewish things, behave like Jews, but they will say, I'm not religious because I don't believe in God.
Yeah, yeah.
White Protestant definition of religion, right? That isn't ever what Judaism ever believed, right? I mean, my grandfather was a Talmud teacher, Torah teacher, Hebrew, Yiddish, did not believe in God. Jewish, definitely. But how do you respond to the God question in that way?
Absolutely. I mean, you know, if people don't want to call themselves religious, I am not going to force that label on them. What I think I'm doing here is I am offering an invitation to a conversation that is certainly happening in academic circles, and I want to offer that conversation to everyone to be a part of it. And for me, I use the word religion to describe these kind of sacred relationships and the ways that we answer big existential questions about who we are, where we come from. To me, the word that gets at all of that fastest is the word religion. That invites us into a conversation about what matters to us and what we think we're doing here. And I want to offer that to folks. But if they're not comfortable with that word, you know, go with God, as we say.
Is nostalgia equal religion?
I think
is it a pathway into religion?
Thank you for that. Yeah, I think it can be, right? I think the nostalgia that I'm looking at has become really institutionalized and really standardized in the ways, and it lets people offers people a pathway into those sacred relationships. So I don't think that all nostalgia is religion, but this type of nostalgia has become religion for American Jews. Thanks.
I have another question. Since October 7th, our sanctuary has been fuller than it has been since COVID.
Yeah.
Because people want to be in Jewish spaces. Are those other spaces finding the same kind of rejuvenation?
You know, that's a great question. I have not been doing this research since October 7th, but I will say that when I started this research, which was in the early 2000s, many people thought that the things that I was looking at might have been a flash in the pan, right? Nostalgia really might have had its moment. And some of the practices that I'm looking at have been around, like Jewish genealogy, have been around since the 1970s and are only growing. And some of them, like artisanal delis, started in the early 2000s and actually are still going strong. Many of the restaurants that I looked at in the early 2000s that I thought would be gone, and the restaurant business is notoriously tough, right? Many of them are still around. And I can't answer the question about since October 7th, but I can say that even though the restaurant business was notoriously hit really hard by COVID, many of the delis that I studied actually did as well as possible in the pandemic because people really reached for comfort and they reached for the things that felt like community to them. So many of the delis that I looked at really did like very strong takeout business. And I think, just anecdotally, that many people are reaching to signs of community and signs of you know, what they feel connects them to others since October 7th. So I think people are reaching out to these things as well as to synagogues.
I just have a question in relationship to your thoughts in terms of people who have grown up in a community the size of this community, which isn't the largest, certainly in any cities across the country, but where there's a significant looking back to our traditions in this community, with like the Jewish Historical Society plays a big role in this community, thinking about our traditions in the past and relationships, talking about delis and all kinds of other issues. And the tendency for a lot of people who have moved on from a bigger Jewish community growing up into smaller communities and more assimilation. I just wonder if you have any thoughts about that with the significance of tradition and maintaining, preserving it.
Yeah. One thing that I think is really interesting is the tension between, focusing on your local community and focusing on these bigger stories, right? So I see that people focusing in, really I would say outside of New York, right? Not just smaller communities, but communities like this that are quite significant. I see people telling stories about their local communities in the same patterns as they do in the same patterns that fit the patterns of the New York story, right? And that's something that I see really being a tension here that people can play with in different ways. And I really struggle with the term assimilation, because I think that people sometimes when we talk about Jews assimilating, what we sometimes mean is Judaism changing or their Jewishness appearing in different ways. And I can see that, I see that in small communities creating really robust ways to express their Judaism, whether it's in synagogue or, as you say, through historical societies and other things. So I think you're pointing to some really interesting conversations there. Thank you.
So I'm going to be selfish and ask two questions.
Amazing.
First question is, you talk a lot about the ways that institutions and the people who have created the children's books and the New Order of Souls have negotiated and navigated Ashkenazi and nostalgia. In your research, did you get anything from the other side of the experience, the people who are asked to experience the nostalgia, but whose stories may not be reflected in this Eastern European narrative?
Yeah, thank you for that question. Were there two questions? I'll answer that one.
There are two questions. The second one will come.
Amazing. Thank you for doing that, because I would for sure forget the first one. So my research really focused on the content creators, on these influencers. But I think organizations like PJ Library are doing and in fact, I think all the organizations that I'm looking at are really trying to listen to their customers or their consumers, and trying to broaden that story. I think it's hard, and as I said, it doesn't always fit. PJ Library, for instance, is making an effort. It isn't always seen, but I do think they're making an effort to represent more diverse Jews and more diverse types of Jewish families. But I think you're getting at that it's really hard. Yeah.
So second question actually relates to part of your answer. You mentioned that a lot of these things, the experience of people is as customers and consumers. How has this drive to nostalgia in religious spaces been mediated by capitalism instead of mediated by a quote-unquote altruistic narratives of religiosity affected the ways that this goes forward into the 21st century?
Yeah, I really appreciate both of these questions. Thank you. Many religious studies scholars would say that when we live under capitalism, there's no escaping from it, right? So this synagogue is driven by money, right? These are real concerns for all of us. And I don't think it's so different to look at these institutions and think about the ways that people consume them, and to think about traditional religious practices. We are often consumers as well as practitioners. I think both of those things can happen. But I also think, when I think about like the deli owners, this really comes up because they're thinking about they're often people who are taking their family stories and literally turning their family stories into profit, right? And I think that you can often be, working to make a living and be doing something that's really sincere. And I think it's important to think about how you can be capitalistic and be sincere at the same time, as we all live under capitalism. Yeah, thanks for that.
Thank you so much for your lecture. It was very amazing. What I want to try or wondering is to describe what is religion, or definition religious is very, very difficult.
Yeah.
Because even לתורה יש מאפיינים, especially in the Jewish community here, every Jew practice her or his religious in his way. I am here 2 years and I saw the different kinds of Judaism and kinds of practice, cultural identity, maybe more to practice cultural identity, to be belonging to the Jewish in different activities, and to describe what is the religious, especially here in American Jewish community, to be very hard in my experience. But what I see is to practice, to find something to belong to the Jewish community, to find some common, to be community, to be strong, to be together, is more important for Jewish community. Someone told me about the event 7 October. I stopped to go to the synagogue to shul. Because if God is here with us, why it's happened October 7? We return to the question in the Shoah. Where were the God? We start to ask a lot of questions about the religious, about our faith, about believing. But it's very interesting what you show us today. Thank you.
So do you have a question?
It's not a question, just a mention.
No, I appreciate that. I can just respond really briefly, if that's okay.
Take as long as you want. You got
Thank
the
you.
mic.
Yeah, I think, for me, I think, that idea about belonging, I think you're exactly right, and I think we totally agree right there. For me, that's why it's really helpful to think about religion as relationships, and it can include that relationship with God, and it can also include that relationship with our community. It can include our relationship with our ancestors, and I think we emphasize those relationships at different moments and at different times. And as you say, Jews in the modern world all have their own types of practices, and I think thinking really broadly about what counts as religion helps us see all of those different practices. So I think I think I agree with you, absolutely. Thank you.
So you're really expanding the definition of religion is what I'm hearing.
Absolutely.
And that there are many ways in, which is interfaith. Couples, I often draw a chart and I say, this is the pie of Judaism, and the religious piece of the pie is the thinnest pie for most American Jews, at least more liberal American Jews. And culture, right? Food, ethnicity, community, family, language takes up most of the pie. And I think you're talking a little bit about that being a religious experience. And I'll have to think about how to do that, but it's so interesting because often people who are Jewish adjacent or coming into Judaism have no concept that this is as important or become really American Jewish religion. They just don't understand it when you've been brought up in a Christian, often Christian home and culture. So I think that is yes. Yeah, but
we're a family of Christians.
you are the family. So you get to have it.
Yeah. So my question is about youth education and how this integrates with youth education and involvement in activities.
Yeah, thank you. Absolutely. I think that, one thing that religious communities often want to do is pass on values. They also want to pass on stories, right? So I think, so one of my case studies is on children's books in particular because because all communities want to pass on their values and want to pass on their stories. And we see this absolutely happening very deliberately through PJ Library especially, really saying these are the stories that are important. These are the stories that need to be told. So, yeah, absolutely. Thank you.
Do you know the website Bechol Lashon?
Yes.
Yeah, so that I think does exactly what you're talking about, but in not an Ashkenazi narrative, but in a broader narrative. You're telling me it's over, you're telling me to be quiet and get
I'm looking to see if there are more
What are
questions.
you doing? What are you doing?
Well, I have a question, but I don't want to preempt other questions, so, and then we probably should have like 2 more questions and be done.
Perfect. Thank you.
So you're drawing like a line between religious practice and nostalgia. Is there a line between nostalgia, religious practice, and identity?
Oh, yeah.
Where exactly does identity fit into that?
Yeah, absolutely. Some Jewish studies scholars have, for instance, suggested to me that what I'm not talking about, and what I'm talking about is not religion, but is in fact identity. To me, identity is a good word for figuring out who we are in the world. And I think, for me, I think the deepest, as I've said, I think the deepest ways that we think about and ask those really existential questions about our identity, for me, I think that those often become religious. So this is all about identity practices, absolutely, and I think that's kind of entangled in all of these. Yeah, thank you.
And so I'll follow up with another related question. You talked earlier about what's at stake, and you used the example of what's at stake for Native American communities, for example. In the moment we find ourselves in now, especially after October 7th, and very much on college campuses, I wonder how your understanding of Jewish identity as also being part of their religious constellation can and ought to inform the ways in which colleges might do a better job engaging with I don't want to use the word protection, but yeah, the protection of safe spaces for Jewish students.
Oh, boy, I think that's a longer conversation to which I don't have a great answer right now, but, I think as the rabbi was suggesting already that, these are all ways that American Jews form their identity. Often when we're talking about issues on college campuses, we're thinking about in what ways our students as professors think about Zionism. And I think that in my work, I'm thinking about what are the major historical stories that American Jews have based their identity around, right? So American Jews have spent a lot of time thinking about the Holocaust and basing their identity around that. American Jews have spent a long time thinking about the history of Zionism and basing their identity around that. And I think a lot of American Jews have said, one of those is way too sad, one of those is way too divisive, and thinking about the nostalgic impulses of Eastern European Jewish heritage has been for them, has largely been more cheerful and a little bit easier for many American Jews. And I think that many of our students have turned towards this story. So I haven't thought about how DEI organizations might incorporate it, but if I were telling the story of American Jews telling histories about themselves, I would say there are 3 balls in the air, and American Jews have been juggling or choosing between those 3 in different ways. Yeah, thanks for that.
I saved my son from Yiddish camp, from Yiddish, it's a very scary place. Very dilapidated, let's just say that. But Yiddish is that other.
Absolutely.
There's a belief that Eastern European culture was really submerged with the creation of the State of Israel, where Hebrew got to be inflated and Yiddish dying, and now there's a resurgence for a lot.
Absolutely.
They're going to the delis and
yeah, there's the Yiddish revival is absolutely a large part of this story, and I will admit that it's work I didn't focus on in this story because I was interested in material culture and the stuff we can touch, and also because there was somebody else writing a really good dissertation on the revival of Yiddish culture. Josh Friedman's dissertation is phenomenal, so thank you. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, and thank you so much, everyone, for hosting us. I invite you all to join us again on April 17th at the JCC in St. Paul. We're having a talk, Movie Made Jews. That should be extremely interesting and related in lots of ways to the talk you just heard. Before the 17th, on the 16th, I invite you to come back here. Temple Israel has very graciously and at the last minute offered to host an Israeli art curator who was invited to do an exhibition in Dubai this past February at a time when Israelis were being disinvited by most countries. Dubai never considered disinviting him, and he put on an art exhibition there, and locals attended. And he's going to be here in town, and he'll be here at Temple Israel on the 16th to talk about that experience of what it's like to be an Israeli art curator in Dubai. So please do come back for that. Thank you very much, and thank you, Rabbi Zimmerman, as always, for your partnership.
Thank you all for coming out. So
Thank you.
wonderful. Thank you.